Daisy. Forward. It's always better to fully indulge in the forbidden fruit, meeting your death with dignity, than to experience neither one nor the other. Chapter 1. If someone's morning starts with coffee, then that's definitely not me. Reluctantly peeling her eyes open, and amidst her mother's shouts, Vicky cast a wary glance at the clock hanging directly across from her bed. It showed exactly 8 in the morning. She saw no other option but to get up and start getting ready for school, so she immediately set about carrying out this far from joyful plan. Jumping out of the bed with a jerk, she walked over to the window and began to gaze at the trees just beyond it, which were gradually dressing themselves in the red shades of early autumn. The recently risen sun made this already marvelous scene even more colorful. But there was no time to get distracted. She had to move on. A shower, brushing her teeth, washing her not so pretty face, all these events quickly followed one another, and soon she was sitting in the kitchen, hurriedly stuffing herself with dry cereal from a box featuring some kind of bee. Catching her mother's disapproving stare, Vicky hurried back to her room to quickly get ready. By 8:30, making almost no noise, she left the apartment with a sense of relief. Unfortunately, the school she despised was only a 5-minute walk away, but those minutes were still a tough lasting moment. The feeling of the big city's drowsiness not yet fully gone, the faint smell of fog mixed with car exhaust, the occasional hum of engines cutting through the silence of the quiet residential area, all of it stirred strange feelings inside her, giving a sense of unity with the world around her. Perhaps these moments life is giving to us for, Vicky thought, while studying the sound of cracks in the asphalt. Only it's a pity that life isn't made up entirely of just the good moments. With such thoughts, before she could even blink, she found herself walking into the school courtyard. Well, here comes my time to prepare for the grind. But surprisingly, the classroom was almost empty. A couple of girls from another class sat at the back desks, passionately discussing something. And there was also one of the class' main jokers, Nicholas, who immediately looked up at her as she entered. Go to room 32, we have a substitute today. Oh, how surprising, and this time there won't even be any kindergarten level pranks aimed at me? You're lucky it's Miss Laura substituting. All responsibility for those not informed will fall entirely on me. And I certainly don't want a scolding from her. In response, Vicky gave an approving hum and, turning sharply, left the room. Indeed, room 32 was much more crowded with those humanoids who were supposed to be considered her classmates. And of course, they immediately noticed her. Oh, look, the Pink Brigade has arrived. Couldn't you wear a shorter skirt? But she silently made her way to her favorite front desk and began taking out her history textbook and notebook. Having finished this not too lengthy task, she pulled out her phone and started scrolling through the already tiresome Twitter feed. But there were no better distractions, and staring blankly at the wall would hardly be the best option. Then the bell rang, signaling the start of lessons. Oddly though, the teacher didn't appear along with it. Noticing this, the class scattered into their little groups and began to chatter quietly, creating the atmosphere of a beehive. True, in that case, it would have been inhabited by some giant bees, but that's probably a whole different story. 10 minutes later, the scene remained unchanged. Sighing deeply, Vicky put her phone away, pulled out her notebook, where she wrote all her poems and songs, and began to ponder a theme for next creation. But as luck would have it, random thoughts kept creeping into her mind, preventing her from focusing properly. She sat in this half-dreamy state until the next bell. Then came Lady Routine, with her endless moving between classrooms and the monotonous raising of her hand, all for the sole purpose of getting a better grade. This sticky mush dragged on until almost 3:30. After that, she could finally breathe in the city air, so wonderfully thick with gasoline fumes. The September sun gently touched her face with its long rays, chasing all the built up gloom and sadness. The feeling of unity with the world around her was once again very close, and she felt it. Although it wasn't far to walk home, there were different routes to take. One of them passed through a small wasteland right near the school. Just a couple hundred steps, and her foot was already stepping onto the dusty ground. Despite the sun being very gentle, it still dazzled her eyes. So she had to lower the gaze to the ground, not giving the bright light the slightest chance to blind her modest self. Of course, there wasn't much to look at down there. Only the occasional patches of dried grass somehow broke up the scene. Suddenly, ahead, an unexpected sight appeared. A snow-white daisy, completely out of place in this empty picture. Vicky stopped and decided to pick it as a symbol that even something so out of step with the overall scene could exist in this world, showing its independence with its very presence. She reached out and easily plucked the object of her attention. Suddenly, almost immediately, a drop of blood appeared on her finger. This greatly surprised our hero, but upon looking more closely at the spot where the flower had just been growing, she discovered a small syringe lying there, containing some kind of substance. Vicky quickly wiped away the already swelling drop, and fortunately, no more followed. Phew! What an adventure! Chapter 2. No one was home, so she didn't have to sit down to do her homework right away. But after a quick snack and a couple of episodes of her favorite show, she had to return to her beloved task. Before sitting at her desk, she went to the window and carefully studied the yellowing trees in the courtyard. A sudden gust of wind tore off the weakest leaves and twirled them in a strange dance. A large grey cloud, visible in the distance, hinted at the heavy rain that would soon begin. But this fact didn't bother Vicky at all, as she loved the rain. While thousands of droplets raced to the ground, there was so much one could do. Continue with chores, retreat into solitude to think about something personal, hug a loved one more tightly while sipping hot chocolate or warm coffee, or even became a spectator of this extraordinary yet familiar phenomenon for the residents of New Orleans. In such moments, she didn't particularly feel like doing anything. But unfortunately, there was no escaping studying, and it held no small significance in life. Slaving over her textbooks, she sat like that until evening, when the sound of the door opening signaled her parents' return. A half-hearted greeting in a tired voice, a nod to filling dinner, and soon Vicky was lying in bed, reading a work of foreign literature. When it was almost midnight, she set the book aside, fluffed her pillow, and with relish buried her face in it. Chapter 3. Today, the world of dreams was a chaotic mess. One dream quickly replaced another, not giving her a chance to grasp any of them. And then, all this jumble abruptly ended. Vicky found herself standing in her parents' bedroom. She approached the bed and began to peer into her father's tense face, who was evidently experiencing far from pleasant dreams. Suddenly, her pale hands stretched forward, and in just a moment, they wrapped around her parents' neck. This struck her as somewhat strange, and almost immediately, as if to confirm her thoughts, her fingers began to tighten sharply. Her father started to wheeze convulsively. Beds of sweat appeared on his face, but this only intensified her grip. It was as if she had fallen into some kind of trance, from which escape seemed impossible, And then, with eyes wide with fear, the daughter stared numbly as her own father died in front of her. A minute later, he was no longer breathing. Yekaterina Ivanovna, Vicky's mother, heard some noises and reluctantly opened her eyes. It took her just a few seconds to comprehend what was happening, and how great was the poor mother's shock when her child grabbed a knife lying on the bedside table and plunged it forcefully into her neck. In an instant, blood gushed from the wound, painting odd patterns on the fresh satin bedding. Chapter 4. Vicky was sobbing. Though her pillow was already almost soaked through, tears continued to stream from her eyes. After 5 minutes of staring numbly at the lifeless bodies of her parents, she began desperately pinching herself, hoping to chase away this horrific dream. But it wouldn't end, and the blood on the bed had already begun to dry in some places. No, this is just impossible. It simply can't be. Could it really all be because of that syringe? But it was just one drop. It can be. I couldn't have lost control over myself because of one tiny detail, but it did happen. And what am I supposed to do now? No one will understand this. Juvenile detention is probably the best case scenario. Relatives, no, they definitely won't understand. The only person who might possibly understand me is Uncle John, but he's far away, all the way in Wyoming, and getting there is almost impossible, given recent events. Okay, I need to move. First, Vicky carefully pulled the knife out of her mother's neck, which made a disgusting, squelching sound during the process. Surprisingly, the blood washed off quite well, though some small brownish stains remained on the surface. Now it was time to get dressed and preferably take some things with her. In the closet, she quickly found an old but practical leather backpack. Inside went a flashlight, a thick winter jacket, and some ancient canned goods she unexpectedly found on the top shelf of the fridge. She threw on a light windbreaker and put on sturdy pants that vaguely resembled military gear. All the money she could find went into her pockets, along with her dad's credit card, a small flashlight that always hung above the hallway mirror, and a lighter, which would have been better off in the backpack, but that thought didn't occur to her at the time. There was one more thing she absolutely needed to take, a small 6-shot revolver, which should be somewhere in her father's possession. But where exactly was another question. She had to search, as it would surely come in handy later. Chapter 5. By 4 in the morning, the apartment looked as though real burglars had been through it. Almost every room had its floor covered with various items, as if someone had deliberately been searching for one specific thing. And, spoiler alert, that thing, for better or worse, was found. It was discovered in the dressing room, inside a nightstand with a lock. The key, meanwhile, was found in her father's dresser, tucked away in a far corner. If I hadn't searched everywhere, I probably never would have found it. Thankfully, her self-defense softener was already fully loaded, and our potential killer felt a slight relief at this, as she had no idea how to load the thing. Only vague images from movies, and that was it. But deep inside, there was a small hope that she wouldn't need it. Chapter 6. As Vicky left the apartment, she was tormented by vague feelings. Of course, there were plenty of documents left in the house that might theoretically be useful, but she simply had no desire to do anything more. And as she stepped outside, a thought entered her mind. A rather frightening thought. At first, she tried to push this horror out of her head, but within a couple of minutes, It had overshadowed all normal and rational thoughts, refusing to give her peace. Those moments of her life were etched into our hero's memory forever. With a shaky step, on legs that felt more like logs, she walked toward the wasteland as if in a fog. On the way, she encountered her neighbor Susan, who, for some reason, was up at such an early hour, but paid no attention to her, merely giving her a distracted glance. The dawn sun dazzled her eyes, but that fact was now irrelevant. And there it was, the cursed place where it all began. After taking about 10 steps, Vicky stopped. Her trembling hands reached out and unfastened the backpack. They utterly refused to obey their owner, who at that moment was entertaining something absurd in her mind. But no matter how much they resisted, at that moment their own interests were of little concern to anyone. A couple more brief moments, and the barrel of the revolver glared menacingly straight into her eyes, as if mocking her. Epilogue. Bright red drops of fresh blood flowed down the daisy's petals. They rolled lazily, leaving behind their characteristic trail. Upon reaching the edge of the petal, they gathered into a drop once more and fell, staining the ground a deep red